Houshmandzade wasn't guessing. When he described how Kevin Stefanski treated SHEDEUR Sanders during his time with the Browns, he laid out a detailed pattern of exclusion that couldn't be ignored. Sanders wasn't benched because of performance issues. He was kept out of team meetings, left off practice rotations, and isolated from meaningful development opportunities. According to Houshmandzade, this wasn't about
if you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
It was personal. Stefanski, backed by a tight inner circle, allegedly allowed personal bias to dictate player access, eroding the very structure of fair competition and leaving a promising young quarterback in limbo. As the locker room watched this unfold, confidence and leadership fractured. Now that Stefanski is out, the damage still lingers. The Browns are trying to re-establish trust with Sanders, giving him reps and clearer communication. But rebuilding a quarterback's confidence is a long game. What Sanders experienced wasn't just being overlooked. It was a form of professional erasure that leaves no stats, no press, just quiet psychological toll. Leadership now faces a different challenge, proving that this rebuild isn't just cosmetic. Because once you've sidelined a player without cause, the burden isn't just on him to bounce back. It's on the organization to earn his belief back, every single day. It started with whispers, then sideline glances, and finally, silence. Not the good kind. The kind that fills a room when something's wrong and no one's brave enough to say it, until now. Former NFL wide receiver Houshmandzade just cracked the dam wide open, leaking details that paint a disturbing picture of what was really happening inside the Cleveland Browns organization during Kevin Stefanski's time as head coach. And at the center of it all? Quarterback SHEDEUR Sanders, rostered, ready, and repeatedly sidelined for reasons that had nothing to do with football. According to Houshmandzade, this wasn't just a coaching preference. It was personal. A pattern of behavior that went far beyond depth charts or strategy. Stefanski allegedly harbored a deep, unspoken dislike toward Sanders, and he didn't hide it behind closed doors. The treatment was cold, calculated, and consistent. SHEDEUR wasn't just overlooked. He was systematically erased. Let's be clear, this wasn't a third-stringer showing up late to practice or flubbing every rep. Sanders showed up, stayed professional, and kept his head down. And still, he was left out of team meetings, iced out of reps, and kept completely out of the quarterback rotation discussions, as if he didn't exist. We're talking about a backup QB treated like a ghost. On the roster but not in the room. Present but invisible. This kind of exclusion doesn't happen by accident. And Houshmandzade didn't mince words. He claims Stefanski's behavior was rooted in a personal bias, one that ignored Sanders' actual capabilities and instead pushed him to the sidelines for reasons unrelated to performance. So why is this a big deal? Because in a league that prides itself on meritocracy, where talent and preparation are supposed to dictate opportunity, this kind of coaching vendetta cuts deep. And it didn't just impact Sanders. It sent shockwaves through the entire locker room. Favoritism was on full display and morale took a hit. Veterans saw it. Teammates felt it. And according to Houshmandzade, it fractured the team's unity. Coaches can set the tone for a franchise, but when that tone is exclusionary and biased, that's a ticking time bomb. And while the fanbase screamed for offensive improvement, Stefanski clung to control, refusing to give Sanders even the slightest opportunity on the field. Post-game interviews? Vague. Evasive. Stefanski tossed out the usual buzzwords, competition, game plan, matchups, but never once addressed the elephant in the room. Never once gave a real reason why Sanders, despite being ready and rostered, was kept in the shadows. Meanwhile, Sanders stayed composed in public. He never pointed fingers. He never threw the staff under the bus. But you could hear it between the lines. In interviews he talked about mental toughness, being prepared, and uncertainty. That kind of language doesn't come from someone battling poor form. It comes from someone being blocked, stalled, and shut out without explanation. And that kind of treatment leaves scars. Not physical ones. Psychological. Being in the building every day doing the work, staying ready, and still being ignored, it chips away at your confidence. It messes with your sense of purpose. And when you're a young quarterback trying to grow, that's career-altering. Sources say Sanders dealt with intense emotional strain during the season. He kept it professional, but the toll was real. Teammates tried to support him, but support only goes so far when the institution itself is shutting the door. And that's the point. This wasn't a case of one guy getting overlooked. This was a systemic, deliberate marginalization of a young athlete whose only crime was showing up to work under a coach who didn't want him there. And let's not forget, Houshmandzade didn't stay quiet during the season. He raised concerns internally, warned about the toxic environment, and tried to get someone to listen. But nothing changed. Stefanski had too much control and no one was willing to challenge it. The message was loud and clear: loyalty and familiarity mattered more than fairness or development. Eventually it all caught up. The locker room was fractured. Offensive progress stalled. The vibes were off. And while the final straw might have looked like a bad record or poor game management from the outside, those on the inside knew better. Stefanski wasn't fired just because of losses. He was let go because the culture he built was broken. A culture where favoritism thrived and young talent got buried. Now, under new leadership, the Browns are trying to course correct. They're giving Sanders more reps, opening the lines of communication, and laying out a clearer developmental path. It's a step forward, but let's not pretend this fixes everything overnight. Sanders may be moving on professionally, but rebuilding trust after that kind of exclusion takes time. The mental recovery is just as important as the physical reps. You can't erase the experience of being deliberately sidelined. You can only prove it won't happen again. The organization is now being forced to confront a harsh reality. When coaching bias goes unchecked, it doesn't just stall a player's career, it damages the entire team. The Browns are learning that lesson the hard way. And this isn't just about one quarterback. It's about how NFL franchises manage power. Stefanski created an echo chamber: tight inner circle, limited input, zero accountability. That kind of autocratic leadership leaves no room for dissent. It creates an environment where bias isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Houshmandzade's testimony matters because it exposes that power dynamic. He didn't just speak out now. He raised the alarm while it was happening. He saw a young player being iced out and tried to get the coaching staff to course correct. But when leadership values loyalty over progress, those warnings fall on deaf ears. Let's not forget the broader picture here. What happened to Sanders doesn't show up on stat sheets. There's no number for how many reps you weren't given. No analytic for meetings you weren't invited to. But the damage is real. It's invisible sabotage. The kind that leaves a player stalled, confused, and questioning his future. And that's the scariest part. Injury? You rehab. Bad performance? You fix it. But this? Being erased for personal reasons? That's harder to fight. Harder to prove. And way harder to overcome. Still, Sanders showed poise. He didn't lash out. He didn't fold. He kept doing the work, even when the work wasn't being recognized. That takes a level of emotional intelligence that most veterans struggle with, let alone a young QB trying to prove himself. As for the Browns, they've got work to do. More than just PR statements and locker room speeches. Real reform means building systems that prevent this kind of unchecked power from festering. Because Stefanski's dismissal didn't just end a bad coaching stint, it revealed a failure in oversight. The kind that lets personal bias become professional policy. If the Browns want to repair what was broken, they need more than a new playbook. They need a new culture, one built on transparency, accountability, and equal opportunity. Because what happened here isn't just a Browns problem. It's an NFL problem. A sports problem. And it's long past time we called it out. If you've been following the Browns saga, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Stefanski's bias was the real issue all along? Was the organization too slow to act? And where do you see Sanders going from here? Make sure you like, share, and subscribe for more breakdowns on the biggest scandals in sports. Because trust, there's always more drama waiting to hit the fan. So let's really sit with what happened here, because the more you think about it, the uglier it gets. We're talking about an NFL franchise where a young quarterback, highly touted, respected by peers, and professionally silent in the face of adversity, was deliberately iced out. Not for fumbling snaps. Not for throwing picks. But because the head coach apparently just didn't like him. And worse, no one did anything about it until it exploded from the inside. Think about the message that sends in a professional locker room. You're showing up day in, day out, grinding through film, practicing like your job depends on it, which it does, and then you see this guy, a backup quarterback with real upside, getting treated like he doesn't even exist. If that can happen to him, what does that mean for everyone else? This wasn't just mismanagement. It was cultural rot. Players saw it. Veterans like Houshmandzade called it out. And still, Stefanski stayed the course, pushing his narrative, keeping his chosen circle close, and pretending everything was fine while the offense sputtered and the locker room vibe flatlined. And here's where it gets deeper. Houshmandzade didn't just air dirty laundry after the fact. He tried to handle it internally. That's the part people miss. He wasn't out here clout chasing. He warned the team in real time. Stefanski's favoritism, his bias, his exclusionary tactics. They were poisoning the environment. But those warnings were brushed off. Management chose short-term optics over long-term health. Classic sports move. Ignore the problem until it becomes a headline. And when the headlines came, that's when the franchise pivoted. That's when the postmortems started. Not when Sanders was getting ghosted at practice. Not when Houshmandzade raised the red flag. But after the wheels had already come off. It's not just a failure of leadership. It's a failure of courage. Because this whole situation could have been avoided with a little backbone and some honest accountability. Instead, Stefanski was allowed to shape the team in his image, and apparently that image didn't include SHEDEUR Sanders. And let's talk about SHEDEUR's response. The quiet strength? That's not easy. Especially in a league where the first sign of frustration can get you labeled as a distraction or not a team guy. He never went scorched earth. He didn't demand trades or throw tantrums. He stayed poised, stayed ready, and let his professionalism speak louder than the silence surrounding him. The subtext in his interviews was crystal clear, though. He talked about being mentally tough. He said all the right things. But read between the lines and it's obvious. He knew the game was rigged. He was being benched for reasons no playbook could explain. And when a player knows they're being sidelined for something that has nothing to do with the game, that's a whole different kind of frustration. That's betrayal. The emotional toll of that kind of treatment is real. This wasn't about ego or entitlement. It was about a young athlete being denied a fair shot, not just on Sundays but every day of the week. No reps, no communication, no clarity, just vibes. Cold, indifferent vibes. And now, as the Browns scramble to rebuild the relationship, they're learning a hard truth. Giving Sanders reps is the easy part. Trust? That takes time. That takes action. You can't undo months of being frozen out with a few nice words and some practice snaps. You have to prove, day after day, that things have actually changed. Let's not sugarcoat it. The Browns let this happen. Whether by passivity or complicity, they let a head coach sideline a player based on something other than performance. And in doing so, they compromised not just Sanders' development, but the integrity of the entire organization. Because if merit doesn't matter, if bias rules the depth chart, what are we even doing here? This is a cautionary tale, and not just for Cleveland. Any NFL franchise, any sports organization really should be paying attention. When power is concentrated in one coach's hands, and that coach surrounds himself with yes men instead of diverse voices, bad decisions get normalized. And when you create a system where favoritism replaces fairness, don't be shocked when the locker room cracks. And yet, this is where it all circles back to Stefanski. This wasn't some passive oversight. This was a choice. A repeated, consistent choice to leave Sanders out of the process. Not once, not twice, but throughout the entire season. The meetings, the reps, the plans, the communication, or rather, the lack of it. Sanders was treated like a non-factor. And you don't do that to someone on accident. You do that because you've already made up your mind. And if your job is to develop talent, that kind of mindset is a disqualifier. What Houshmandzade exposed here isn't just drama. It's a structural flaw in how some teams are run. Stefanski had unchecked power. He answered to no one when it came to rotation or reps. And when someone like Houshmandzade spoke up, he was ignored. That's a toxic system. A losing system. And no surprise, it did lead to losses. Not just on the scoreboard but in culture, morale, and reputation. No amount of coaching acumen can make up for a broken locker room. And eventually the front office had to face that reality. Stefanski wasn't just out of sync with the players, he was actively damaging them. His post-game pressers, with all the talk of competition and schematics, were smoke screens. Just empty phrases to justify decisions that were clearly personal. There was no strategy in ghosting a developing QB. No logic in completely benching potential. Just bias, thinly veiled in coach speak. And now the Browns are left cleaning up the mess. They're trying. Sanders is getting more reps. There's more transparency now. The new leadership seems to understand what was broken. But that doesn't mean trust has been fully restored. Because when a player is excluded so systematically, rebuilding isn't about giving them the ball, it's about giving them belief. That it won't happen again. That someone is actually watching now. That talent matters more than personality clashes. And while Sanders has been composed, make no mistake, he deserved better. He deserved an honest shot. And the fact that it took a full-blown internal crisis for him to even be acknowledged? That's a stain the Browns won't shake easily. The fact that this entire situation hinged on one coach's feelings should be alarming to everyone. Because if a player's future can be stalled by something so subjective, so personal, then the system isn't broken. It was never fair to begin with. And let's not forget what this says about leadership. Real leaders don't fear competition. They don't alienate players because of personality. They cultivate depth, nurture talent, and welcome challenges to their plans. Stefanski did the opposite. He closed ranks, played favorites, and froze out a player who could have helped the team, all because of a grudge or worse, an ego trip. So now the Browns move forward, but with a warning label. This happened once. And unless they overhaul how they evaluate coaching behavior, it could happen again. Because it's not just about who calls plays. It's about how they lead. And whether the system in place protects players from being buried for the wrong reasons. In the end, this wasn't a football story. This was a human story. About power, exclusion, and the quiet dignity of a player who refused to snap back, even as he was shut out. Let's be real. The SHEDEUR-Sanders situation didn't just expose a problematic coach. It exposed an entire infrastructure that let that kind of bias operate unchecked. You don't end up with a player being excluded from team meetings and stripped of reps unless everyone around that head coach either agrees with the approach, or is too afraid to question it. And that silence? That collective shrug? It's just as dangerous as Stefanski's actions. Because at some point, somebody in that building had to notice. Quarterbacks don't just disappear. Not when they're supposed to be your next up option. Not when they've got the discipline, maturity, and raw ability to develop into something real. So what happens when everyone sees the favoritism and no one says a word? You create a culture where players start asking themselves, am I next? If he can be erased with no explanation, who else is on the chopping block for reasons that have nothing to do with performance? This kind of atmosphere breaks trust on every level. It fractures relationships between players and coaches, between players and front office, and even among teammates. Because once the meritocracy illusion shatters, what's left? Politics, silence, self-preservation. And let's not overlook the optics either. SHEDEUR-Sanders isn't just any player. He came into the league with expectations, pedigree, and attention. And instead of being nurtured and challenged to meet those expectations, he was sidelined like an unwanted project. That doesn't just hurt his development, it stains his reputation. The league watches this stuff. Other coaches, other GMs. If a player isn't seeing the field, the narrative starts writing itself. Maybe he's not ready. Maybe he's not working hard. All while the truth is sealed away behind closed doors and smug press conference cliches. But thankfully, Sanders didn't fold. He didn't let the treatment derail his character. He didn't blast the team even when he had every right. Instead, he played the long game. He waited it out. Kept his words measured, his presence steady, and his professionalism intact. That takes strength, especially when you know the people in charge are working against you. And it says a lot that Houshmandzade was the one to speak up publicly. Because you know this wasn't some off-the-cuff rant. This was a veteran who watched the season unfold, tried to intervene behind the scenes, and finally reached the point where staying silent felt worse than speaking out. And the second he spoke, everything clicked. All those strange decisions during the season. The vague comments. The lack of clarity on Sanders' role. It all made sense because it wasn't about game plans. It wasn't about performance. It was about a coach who had already decided who mattered and who didn't. That's what stings the most. SHEDEUR was never given the chance to earn or lose his spot. He was locked out before the competition even began. And now that Stefanski's out, the Browns are trying to play catch-up. They're showing Sanders he matters. They're giving him actual reps. They're talking about open communication and a renewed focus on development. But even if it's genuine, and maybe it is, it's still reactive. It's still too late to get back the time that was wasted. Because that rookie season? That's supposed to be foundational. That's where reps and live-game exposure shape confidence. Every week Sanders sat invisible was another week of stalled progress. Not just in the stat books, but in rhythm, in chemistry, in experience. And while Sanders hasn't walked away, let's not pretend like the damage disappears just because the staff changes. When you've been treated like a ghost, it takes a lot to believe the next group won't do the same. There's a mental hurdle now. A scar that wasn't there before. And every new coach, every teammate, every meeting, he's got to wonder, am I really part of this plan now or just a placeholder again? That kind of doubt can linger. And that's why it's so important that the Browns do more than just involve him. They have to empower him. They have to back up the reps with real feedback, real responsibility, and real investment. Not just to fix their mistake, but to make sure it never happens again. Because this is bigger than just one player or one coach. It's about what kind of organization the Browns want to be going forward. One that protects their young players and holds coaches accountable? Or one where personal agendas get to define careers? The SHEDEUR-Sanders saga should be a turning point. A wake-up call that systems need checks. That no coach should be able to play puppet master with zero oversight. Because development isn't just about training, it's about opportunity. And when opportunity is doled out based on favoritism, you don't have a football team. You have a hierarchy masquerading as one. So yeah, the Browns are rebuilding. On the field. In the culture. Around SHEDEUR. But this time they better mean it. Thanks for watching. If this whole situation made your jaw drop, let us know in the comments. Do you think SHEDEUR will rise now that the roadblocks are gone? And how should teams hold coaches accountable when bias crosses the line? Hit that like button, share with your sports group chat, and subscribe if you want more deep dives on the wildest drama happening behind the scenes in sports. Because stories like this, they're just the beginning.